Tamriel, Dawn's beauty in the language of the Altmer, or Tazukan in the Dragon's Tongue, is the continent upon which all the Elder Scrolls games take place. Home to many diverse races and even more conflicts, Tamriel has been host to many adventures. You've experienced Tamriel in your own way, but want to learn more about its story. Well, to get to the heart of the story, you have to go back to the beginning. They were the first to sit upon the ruby throne, the first to call the white gold tower home. They were the first to raise a mighty empire, but after rebellion would soon retire. Much like their lost Dwemer cousins, the Ayleids were a magnificently sophisticated race who cradled civilization, only to have it ripped away from them, leaving Tamriel to pick up the pieces. Many have forgotten it was the Ayleids who laid the groundwork for the great empires raised throughout Tamriel's history. Though not as technologically advanced as the Dwemer, culturally the Ayleids were well ahead of their time. The Ayleids, with their many diverse kingdoms, were the first to dream of unity. While the young, savage races of men were still huddled around their campfires, Ayleid ingenuity had erected vast cities, towering monuments, and their society was the envy of the 9 provinces. In ancient times, Ayleids dominated Tamriel's centralmost province of Cyrodiil, and so they were given the name Heartland High Elves because, like all elves on Tamriel, the Ayleids came out of the High Elves of the Somerset Isles. Thanks to their highborn ancestry, the Ayleids boast big intellects and agile frames like the rest of their race. As for their appearance, like all elves, they are thin and lean, with pointed ears and angular faces. From fire life, from light magic, to say the Ayleids were gifted in the arcane arts is a bit of an understatement. This conclusion can be drawn from their many ancient cities that still dot Cyrodiil's landscape today. Their ruins contain a vast variety of stones filled with magica essences. Upon further studies, scholars have been able to gather that the Ayleids found a way to harvest magical energy from the stars themselves, a process that has not been replicated since. Using these magical stones, Ayleid mages could replenish their magical energy, making them last longer in confrontations. On the note of harvesting magical energy, a visitor to Cyrodiil will often stumble across great white basins called Ayleid wells. These wells are unlike anything found in the 9 provinces and possibly beyond. They are known to passively harvest magical energy from starlight. Those with a skill can draw magica from Ayleid wells to restore their own reservoirs of magical energy. A mage that has exhausted his or her energy needs only seek out these wells. You can see how beneficial this could be both in everyday activity as well as in the defense of Ayleid settlements. Another magical feat of strength attributed to the Ayleids was the creation and maintaining of Varla stones. Varla stones are remarkably powerful devices that enabled the Ayleids to restore magical energy to enchanted items. An enchanted sword, for instance, can wield enchantments of fire, ice, and lightning, and Varla stones keep these enchants at maximum power by continuously feeding them with magica required to maintain the enchant. Because of these stones' great value and utility, it is assumed Ayleid soldiers would carry these stones onto the battlefield. Since Varla stones are relatively small, you could see how an Ayleid infantryman could carry them on their person. A sword that slashes and pierces is good, a sword that melts armor is better. As you've probably gathered by now, as a race, the Ayleids were not afraid to tap into the more supernatural mysteries of Tamriel in order to gain an edge. Magic was a revered part of their society, and it bled through into their religion. In accordance with High Elf tradition, the Ayleids believed the earth was composed of 4 basic elements: earth, water, air, and light. The Ayleids in particular believed that the most spiritual form an element could take was starlight, as the stars were the link between Mundus and Aetherius. Mundus being our mortal plane of existence, and Aetherius being the immortal plane of the Aedra. When Magnus left Mundus to pass into the Aedric realm of Aetherius, he is said to have torn a veil between the two realms, giving us the sun and stars, enabling mortals to draw magic from the heavens. The Ayleids recognized the Aedra's role in giving them their magical abilities, so as a people, these Heartland High Elves worship the Aedra. On this note, you might find it interesting that Tamriel has all but forgotten the original purpose of the iconic White Gold Tower. The tower wasn't originally built for kings and emperors. The tower was built by the Ayleids as a monument to the Aedra. In ancient times, the White Gold Tower was called the Temple of the Ancestors, referring to the ancestors of the Elves, the immortal Aedra. For most of the other races on Tamriel, worship stops at the Aedra or the Daedra, but for the Ayleids, power meant these lines had to be crossed. Instead of limiting themselves by worshipping one side over the other, the Ayleids chose to praise the Aedra while conspiring with the Daedra. So great became the influence of Daedra on Ayleid culture that the Heartland Elves commanded massive armies of Daedric minions. Wielding both the power of the Daedra through powerful armies and the power of the Aedra through magical prowess, the Ayleids brought an entire province under their control by enslaving the race of men residing in it, a sin they would one day pay greatly for. The foaming wave, so thunderous, so mighty, heralds the lordly elves. The story of the Ayleids is one of migration, domination, and ultimately self-destruction. Like all Tamrielic elves, the story of the Ayleids starts on the mysterious continent of Aldmeris. From Aldmeris, the ancient Altmer migrated to the Somerset Isles. Why the Ayleids eventually broke off from their elven brethren is unknown to us, but we can assume this division occurred for the same reason that the Dark Elves found themselves in Morrowind, because worship of the Daedra is not tolerated in Somerset. Regardless of how they came to be there, the Ayleids would find themselves in Cyrodiil in a time before the First Era. How the Ayleids came to rule all of Cyrodiil can be attributed to their incessant need for power. It was this ambition that drove these elves to do truly magnificent and sometimes truly terrible things. The Ayleids of this ancient era saw breakthroughs in rose structures that baffle scholars in the modern era. Given all their skills and feats, the Ayleids still craved more. They went on to employ entire armies of Daedra to conquer, subjugate, and enforce their rule in Cyrodiil. At first, the men of Cyrodiil had managed to resist the Ayleids, but they could not withstand their Daedric allies. Through their pact with the Daedra, the Ayleids dominated and enslaved the men of Cyrodiil. They rose their great temple, and ever since, the White Gold Tower has stood as a symbol of dominance in Cyrodiil. He who holds the tower holds the reins of the province. The first empire Tamriel had ever seen was claimed in the name of the Ayleids. Slaves were utilized by the Ayleid Empire for a variety of purposes, but their main purpose was the building and maintenance of their empire's infrastructure. The men of Cyrodiil had the Elves to answer to, and the Elves had to answer to the Daedra. Daedric masters demand many things in exchange for power, chief among them sacrifices. According to legend, some Ayleids turned cruelty into an art form. Various Ayleid settlements became famous for their elaborate methods of torturing their slaves. One such method involved the setting ablaze of human children. The Heartland High Elves ruled Cyrodiil for many generations, and although their power was absolute, they did not know contentment. For reasons now lost to us, the Ayleids took to fighting amongst themselves in a civil war that would one day spell their race's downfall. You see, civil war left the Ayleids weak, and word had reached the slaves in Cyrodiil about the events taking place in Skyrim. At this time, Skyrim had emerged from a war of its own. The race of men who called themselves Nords had overthrown the Snow Elves who once ruled the province of Skyrim. The stories from the north inspired the slaves now serving under an elven empire at war with itself. The Nords of Skyrim, now free from their elven yoke, lent aid to their enslaved relatives under the Ayleid Empire, and in only a year, the slave queen Alicia stood outside of the White Gold Tower with an army at her back. After millennia of rule, the Ayleid Empire fell, giving way to the Elysian Empire, securing the shift of power from elves to men on Tamriel henceforth. The story of how the Daedra-loving Ayleids fell to their human slaves is one that has been retold time and again. It has served as a kind of rallying cry for the Nords Imperials and other races of men on Tamriel. A story of how the oppressed can overthrow his oppressor even if that oppressor is a highborn elf. The story that isn't often told is the one of how some Ayleids actually assisted man in their quest for freedom. Not every Ayleid was the pompous, power-hungry elf the stories would have you believe. As a matter of fact, there were whole Ayleid settlements that had no part in the Ayleid Empire. When the human slaves of the Ayleid Empire rebelled, many Ayleid lords pledged their swords in support of the slave queen, and they died on the battlefield fighting side by side with man. By the end of the slave rebellion, the Ayleids were far from the extinct race they are today. As a matter of fact, the Ayleid lords that assisted in the rebellion were integrated into the newly formed Elysian Empire as vassals and royal advisors to the queen and her new human nobility. This arrangement only made sense. I mean, who, if not the Ayleids, knew the logistics of maintaining an empire? History has failed us because it has mostly forgotten the first human empire was one comprised of both man and elves. Despite these truths, bad feelings and resentment would ultimately decide the fate of the Ayleid race. Alicia's eventual passing marked the rising of a religious group called the Elysian Order, and they had very, very strong opinions about their old Ayleid masters. Its doctrine called for the expulsion of the entire elven race. The Ayleid lordships were abolished, and feeling no welcome to stay in Cyrodiil, the Ayleids left the province upon their own free will. Now driven from the land they had resided in for generations, the Ayleids were a people without a home. Once the very beacon of civilization on Tamriel, the other mortal races now call the Ayleids Wild Elves, because they are without sanctuary. Although their race has not been seen for centuries, it is possible that the Ayleids are still out there. Although we have no pure Ayleids left in civil society, their bloodlines carry on. After the Wild Elves left Cyrodiil, some of them found solace in the province of High Rock. There they are only assumed to have intermingled with the humans who call High Rock home. The Bretons are, after all, part elf, and particularly gifted in the ways of magic. But that is a story for another day.